Captain James Harrison never expected his routine supply run to end with his ship's navigation system failing spectacularly above an uncharted moon. The Starweaver's engine sputtered and died, leaving him helpless as the rocky surface rushed up to meet him. Impact was inevitable, but years of training kicked in as he managed to somewhat control their descent. The crash scattered debris across the moon's gray surface, the Starweaver's hull groaning as it came to rest at an awkward angle. James pulled himself from the wreckage, checking his environmental suit's readings. Breathable atmosphere, but thin. Gravity slightly less than Earth normal. Temperature hovering just above freezing. He surveyed the damage with growing dread. The communication array was destroyed, the engines beyond repair with his limited tools. He was stranded on this desolate rock with only a few weeks of emergency rations. Well, he muttered, this is less than ideal. As night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill, James noticed movement in the shadows of nearby rock formations. Something was watching him. He reached for his emergency beacon, but kept his posture relaxed, non-threatening. Years of first contact training had taught him that showing fear or aggression could be fatal. The figure that emerged stopped his breath. Tall and ethereally graceful, with skin that seemed to absorb and reflect the starlight, she moved with an otherworldly elegance that marked her as clearly non-human. Her eyes were her most striking feature, large, luminous orbs that seemed to hold galaxies within them. She was also clearly starving. Her frame was too thin, her movements careful as if conserving energy. When her gaze fixed on the ration pack in his hand, James saw a flash of desperate hunger cross her face. In that moment, he made a choice that would change both their lives. He slowly held out the ration pack, making his intentions clear. Here, he said softly, knowing she wouldn't understand the word but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. You need this more than I do. She hesitated, those incredible eyes darting between his face and the offered food. Then, with movements so careful they seemed almost ritualistic, she accepted the package. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, sending an electric tingle through his arm. Her skin was cool to the touch, like morning dew. As she ate, James noticed something that made his heart ache. She was crying. Silent tears that caught the starlight and seemed to glow traced down her cheeks. But mixed with the sorrow in her expression was something else, gratitude so profound it needed no translation. James settled back against a piece of his broken ship, giving her space while staying close enough to show he meant no harm. He had no idea what circumstances had left her alone and starving on this forgotten moon, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he couldn't abandon her. I'm James, he said quietly, touching his chest. Then he gestured to her with an open palm, inviting but not demanding. She studied him for a long moment before touching her own chest and making a sound like crystal wind chimes, Nixus. The next few days established a careful routine between James and Nixus. She would appear at dusk, drawn to the small camp he'd made from his ship's wreckage. Each time, she moved with the same fluid grace that made her seem like she was floating rather than walking. Each time, her luminous eyes held the same mix of caution and desperate hope. James found himself talking to fill the silence, not because he expected her to understand, but because it helped him maintain his sanity in this desolate place. He told her about Earth, about the sprawling cities and vast oceans, about the way clouds looked at sunset and how rain smelled in spring. Nixus listened with unwavering attention, her head tilted slightly, those galaxy-filled eyes fixed on his face as if she could absorb the meaning through pure concentration. One evening, as the moon's 3 moons cast overlapping shadows across the rocky ground, James was explaining the concept of coffee when Nixus did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the air in front of her, leaving trails of soft light hanging in the space between them. The lights twisted and danced, forming patterns that reminded James of Aurora Borealis back on Earth. That's incredible, he breathed, watching as the lights pulsed in rhythm with her movements. Nixus's expression softened, and for the first time, he saw her smile. It transformed her entire face, making her seem less alien and more like someone who had simply been waiting for a reason to be happy. As the lights faded, James noticed she was shivering slightly. The temperature had dropped significantly, and unlike him in his environmental suit, she had no protection against the cold. Without hesitation, he removed his emergency thermal blanket and held it out to her. Nixis stared at the offering, her eyes widening with that now familiar look of disbelief at kindness freely given. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the metallic fabric. Then, to James's surprise, she didn't take the blanket. Instead, she moved closer and sat beside him, her shoulder barely touching his arm. The message was clear, she wanted to share the warmth, not take it for herself. As they sat together under the alien sky, James realized something had shifted between them. Trust, that fragile bridge between strangers, was beginning to form. He noticed how Nixis's natural glow seemed brighter when she was relaxed, how her movements became less hesitant and more fluid, how she had started mimicking his gestures in an apparent attempt to communicate. But with this growing connection came growing concern. His rations were running low, and he had yet to see Nixis eat anything other than what he shared with her. The moon seemed devoid of any natural food sources, no vegetation, no smaller creatures, nothing that could sustain life. How had she survived here before his arrival? And more importantly, how long could they both survive with their limited resources? James checked his emergency beacon again, knowing it was futile. The crash had damaged it, limiting its range to barely beyond the moon's atmosphere. Unless a ship happened to pass very close by, their chances of rescue were slim. He glanced at Nixis, who was tracing patterns in the dust with one delicate finger, leaving faint trails of light in her wake. He had survived the crash, but survival wasn't enough anymore. He had to find a way to ensure they both made it off this moon alive. As if sensing his thoughts, Nixis looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight above. In that moment, James made a silent promise: whatever secrets this moon held, whatever had left Nixis alone here, he would find a way to help her. They would survive this together. Ames woke to find the Starweaver systems blaring warnings about an approaching storm. Through the cracked viewscreen, he watched as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, unlike anything he'd seen since landing. They moved with unnatural speed, carrying an ominous purple glow that set his nerves on edge. His first thought was of Nixis. In all their encounters, she'd never appeared during daylight hours. Where did she go? How would she weather this storm? The thought of her trying to survive these harsh conditions alone made his chest tight with worry. He gathered his emergency gear and ventured out, fighting against winds that grew stronger with each passing minute. The storm's approach brought with it a strange electrical charge that made his hair stand on end. His suit sensors were going haywire, registering energy readings that shouldn't be possible. That's when he saw it, a structure half buried in the rocky ground, previously hidden by shadows and debris. Its architecture was alien, all sweeping curves and iridescent materials that seemed to shift color as he approached. How had he missed this before? A familiar figure stood in the entrance, Nixis. But something was different about her. Her natural glow had intensified, pulsing in rhythm with the storm's energy. She beckoned to him urgently, her movements sharp with anxiety. James didn't hesitate. He rushed toward her, barely making it inside before a massive surge of energy lit up the sky behind him. The storm had arrived in full force, bringing with it waves of purple lightning that danced across the moon's surface. Inside the structure, James found himself in a space that defied his understanding of physics. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting and flowing like liquid metal. Patterns of light, similar to those Nixis created but far more complex, covered every surface. Nixis placed her hand against one wall, and the patterns responded, forming what James realized were words in an alien script. She turned to him, her eyes intense with purpose, and for the first time, he sensed she was trying to tell him something crucial. She pointed to herself, then to the walls, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire structure. "You lived here," James said slowly, understanding dawning. "This was your home." But why was she alone now? Where were her people? Nixus nodded, seeming to understand his question. She touched another section of wall, and new images formed, ships leaving, masses of her people evacuating, a great disaster looming. But something was wrong with the sequence. Nixus hadn't left with them. She had stayed behind, or worse, been left behind. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. She hadn't just been stranded here, she had been abandoned. The hunger in her eyes when they first met, the disbelief at simple kindness, it all made terrible sense now. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this ancient structure, a different kind of storm was brewing. James felt anger rising in his chest, anger at whoever had left her here to die, anger at the cruelty of abandoning someone so gentle. Nixus must have sensed his emotion because she moved closer, placing one delicate hand on his arm. Her touch carried a slight electrical charge, like static electricity but warmer, more intentional. The patterns on the walls shifted again, forming new configurations that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Then something extraordinary happened. The patterns began to coalesce into recognizable shapes, crude but clear representations of Earth objects James had described to her. A coffee cup. A rain cloud. A city skyline. She had been learning from him all along, creating a visual language from his stories. James stared in amazement as Nixus continued to manipulate the patterns, her movements becoming more confident. She wasn't just showing him her past, she was building a bridge between their worlds, one image at a time. In this moment of shared understanding, the vast distance between their species seemed to shrink, replaced by something far more powerful than words could express. As the storm raged outside, James and Nixus delved deeper into the alien structure. The living walls continued to respond to Nixus's touch, revealing more about her people's history on this moon. Through the complex interplay of light and symbol, a devastating story emerged. Her people, the Luminarii, had established this outpost generations ago to study the moon's unique energy patterns. The purple storms weren't just weather phenomena, they were manifestations of an immense power source deep within the moon's core. The Luminarii had learned to harness this energy, using it to power their civilization and enhance their natural abilities to manipulate light. But something had gone wrong. The energy grew unstable, threatening to tear the moon apart. The Luminarii made a desperate decision to evacuate, believing the moon would soon destroy itself. In their haste to escape, they had overlooked one of their own. Nixus, a young researcher, had been in a remote observation post when the evacuation began. By the time she returned, her people were gone. James watched as Nixus projected these memories onto the walls, her movements growing more agitated as she reached the moment of abandonment. The lights dimmed with her sadness, casting shadows across her ethereal features. But there was more to the story, something that made James's scientific mind race with possibilities. The moon hadn't destroyed itself as predicted. Instead, the energy had stabilized, settling into a pattern of periodic storms. Nixus had survived by learning to predict these storms and take shelter in the remaining structures. She had also discovered something her people hadn't realized in their panic: the energy could be safely channeled in small amounts, which explained her ability to create and manipulate light with such precision. "You've been studying it all this time," James said with growing admiration. "Alone, with no support, you continued the research." Nixus responded by creating a complex diagram in the air between them, showing how the moon's energy flowed in predictable cycles. James pulled out his damaged emergency beacon, studying it with new eyes. "The energy interferes with our communications," he mused. "That's why the beacon's range is so limited. But maybe..." He looked at Nixus, an idea forming. "Maybe we could use your understanding of the energy patterns to boost the signal." Nixus tilted her head, considering. Then she moved to another section of wall, revealing technical schematics left behind by her people. James might not understand the alien script, but engineering diagrams spoke a universal language. Together, they began piecing together a plan. Working in tandem, they salvaged components from the Star Weaver and combined them with still-functioning luminary technology. Nixus's knowledge of the moon's energy patterns proved invaluable, while James's practical engineering skills helped adapt the alien tech to work with his human equipment. As they worked, James noticed something changing in Nixus. The deep sorrow that had haunted her eyes began to fade, replaced by a spark of purpose. She moved with more confidence, her natural glow brightening whenever they made progress. She wasn't just helping him create a rescue beacon, she was reclaiming her role as a scientist, a researcher, a being of knowledge and capability. But their work revealed another truth, one that added urgency to their task. The moon's energy wasn't as stable as it appeared. Nixus's long-term measurements showed a slow but steady increase in storm intensity. Her people's predictions hadn't been wrong, they'd just been off on the timing. The moon was still heading toward a catastrophic event. They had to get off this rock, and soon. But as James watched Nixus masterfully manipulate the complex energy flows, he realized he couldn't leave without ensuring her research survived. Her years of solitary study, her discoveries about safely harnessing this powerful energy source, it was too valuable to lose. The rescue beacon wasn't just about saving their lives anymore. It was about giving Nixus a chance to share her findings with the universe, to prove that her sacrifice and determination hadn't been in vain. As another storm battered the structure around them, James made a silent vow. He would make sure her story was heard, her discoveries recognized. The universe needed to know about the lone luminary who never gave up, who turned abandonment into opportunity. Time became their enemy as James and Nixus worked to modify the emergency beacon. The storms grew more frequent, their purple lightning strikes leaving scorch marks across the moon's surface that hadn't been there before. Each new storm brought stronger energy surges, confirming Nixus's calculations about the moon's deteriorating stability. Their supplies dwindled dangerously low. James had been sharing his remaining rations with Nixus, but now they were down to their last few packets. The luminary structure provided shelter, but it couldn't give them what they needed most, food and a way off this dying rock. During one particularly violent storm, their jerry-rigged equipment sparked and sizzled, nearly overloading from the intense energy waves. Nixus moved with incredible speed, her hands dancing through the air as she created light barriers to protect their work. The effort clearly drained her, her natural glow dimmed significantly, and she swayed on her feet. James caught her before she fell, surprised again by how light she felt in his arms. "That's enough for today," he said firmly, helping her sit. She tried to protest, her luminous eyes fixed on their unfinished beacon, but he shook his head. "You're exhausted. We'll continue after you rest." As Nixus recovered, she showed James more of her research through the structure's responsive walls. Her years of isolation hadn't been spent in mere survival, she had mapped the moon's energy patterns in incredible detail, developing theoretical models that could revolutionize energy production across the galaxy. But her latest projections were alarming. The moon's core was becoming increasingly unstable, and they had weeks at most before catastrophic failure. Working through another sleepless night, they finally achieved a breakthrough. By synchronizing the beacon's signal with the natural energy pulses Nixus had mapped, they could use the moon's power to amplify their distress call. The only catch? They would need to wait for a major storm to generate enough power, and ride out that same storm while hoping the signal reached someone before the equipment overloaded. Their chance came sooner than expected. The structure's sensors detected a massive energy surge building in the moon's core. This storm would be larger than any they'd seen before. It was their best chance at rescue, and potentially their last, given the intensity of the readings. As they made final preparations, James noticed Nixus creating intricate patterns of light on the walls, more complex than anything she'd shown him before. When he moved closer, he realized she was recording her research findings in a format that could be easily transferred to human data systems. She turned to him, her expression both determined and vulnerable. The message was clear: even if something went wrong, even if they didn't both make it, she wanted her discoveries preserved. Years of solitary research, of turning abandonment into scientific advancement, all encoded in light and shadow. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently, making a silent promise. Her work would not be lost. Her story would be told. The storm hit with unprecedented force. The structure groaned under the assault as they activated their modified beacon. Nixis stood with her hands raised, channeling the savage energy around them into their makeshift array while James monitored the equipment, making constant adjustments to prevent overload. Purple lightning crashed against Nixis's light barriers as she fought to maintain control. Her glow flickered dangerously, but her determination never wavered. Everything depended on the next few minutes: their survival, her research, the chance to warn others about the moon's impending destruction. Through the chaos, James watched Nixis with a mixture of awe and concern. She had survived years of isolation, never giving up hope, never stopping her research. Now she was risking everything on this one chance. He silently urged their signal to reach someone, anyone who could help. They had come too far, discovered too much, grown too close to fail now.